you wouldn't have the word majesty. And you would not know what majesty is, and you would not know what the majesty of God is. And Baha'u'llah says we do not want people to be deprived of this. But this will be a democratic, or what not democratic, constitutional kingship. Something which is very different from the kings which existed at the time of Baha'u'llah. Constitutional kingship. Who knows? I have again heard this. I don't like to repeat Pilgrim's notes, but we have heard that Shoghi Effendi has said every country in the world will have a king, including the United States of America. So watch for yourselves here. Now, the institution of kingship, whatever happens, will become eventually part of the world order of Baha'u'llah, because you cannot have anything in the future but the world order of Baha'u'llah, which will have a system, which will be a system by which the whole world will combine all its resources and its institutions together, and how they will merge we do not know. So now the second sign, as I said, that Baha'u'llah gives for the coming of age of humanity is that the institution of kingship will be discredited so much that people do not want to take the burden on. This has happened. And the third sign, which also has happened and has taken place already, on a smaller scale, but anyhow it has taken place, is that the alchemy, he says, will become an achieved, alchemy will be achieved. That is the transmutation of copper into gold, of any metal, the transmutation, the changing of elements. Well, now this has already taken place in the atomic laboratories, and you can do this through the process of processes of the atomic physics. But it is so expensive that if you change them, it's going to be very expensive. I read some time ago in the newspapers, years ago, that one of the nations, Russians, have said that they can produce gold, or they will produce gold, which would be cheaper than what is in the market. Now, again, this is an indication, this alchemy. By the way, when alchemy has been one of those things that all the early men of knowledge and science of those days, from the early days of Islam, they have been working on it. Many people, actually the word alchemy, the word chemist is an Arabic word, alchemy, kimia, it's from kimia, which is an Arabic word. And but during Baha'u'llah's lifetime also, many of his disciples during his lifetime were involving themselves in this act of producing, of testing and experimenting. And Baha'u'llah stopped them. He said, this is not the time for it. He told them to stop this. And he said, when the time comes, it will be discovered. And he said, when it will be discovered, we have a tablet of Baha'u'llah which is very striking. He says, when it is discovered, mankind will discover a force which can destroy the whole world. And he prays that God will not, and this is, as I said, associated with the discovery of the atomic energy. So now, you see, these are the signs of the coming of age of humanity. And in this Pilgrim's Note, we heard Shoghi Effendi said that the lesser peace and the coming of age of humanity is the same thing, which from the signs that I mentioned to you, it's very likely. Now, all the other things that he has spoken about it is very beautiful, and you can find it in the writings. He says you can divide, he says you can, in order to study the progress of the world in the future, you can first divorce the faith from it, and let us examine the non-Baha'i world after the lesser peace to see what processes and what stages it will go through, the non-Baha'i world. First of all the social teachings of Baha'u'llah. Now, forget about the Baha'i faith and the influence of the Baha'i faith. Forget about that. But look at the non-Baha'i world. Let us have the branch of humanity, which is non-Baha'i branch. The non-Baha'i branch will go through so many stages of development and progress, using all the social teachings of Baha'u'llah, such as equality of men and women, establishment of a universal language, establishment of a world government, the making of one weight currency and measures, the federation of nations. All of these things will take place, the social teachings of Baha'u'llah. Education for all, the tapping of the resources of the world equitably, and these things will happen without necessarily knowing that these are from Baha'u'llah, that these are the social teachings which will be carried out. And as a result of it, he says, a great blessing will come upon mankind. The wars are abolished, and the blessing which will bring with it is that of social and economic and scientific developments that mankind will make, in such a way that the planet will become like one country, literally, like a federation of nations. Like here in the United States, you have federations of nations, of states, but really they are one country. And this will become the world, and that we become so used to mixing together and rubbing shoulders with all kinds of peoples, of all nationalities and peoples, that it's just like living in one country from the point of view of social and economic and other developments. Now then he says that looking in this branch of humanity, which is now devoid of the faith, and the faith has nothing to do with it at the moment, directly, he says that religions lose their influence more and more, and they cannot influence humanity. The soul of people will be starving for spiritual food, although they are progressing socially, economically, politically, but spiritually they will be in starvation, a spiritual starvation. And therefore there would be a great deal of delinquency, maybe. People have plenty of things to, plenty pleasures, and plenty of food, plenty of comfort, security, and this will bring about, and the starvation of spiritual food, it's a terrible effect on the soul of man. The soul of man will be in a very depressed position in this particular branch of humanity. And then he says, now let us look at the faith and what the faith does. The other branch will go through stages. These are all written down by Shoghi Effendi now. You know, these things that I'm saying, it's not really Pilgrim's Notes. As I said, these are all can be verified in the writings. Says the faith will go through different stages. The first is the stage of obscurity. And we are in obscurity in some parts of the world. But in some countries, of course, we are not in obscurity. It doesn't come together at the same time all over the world. One country, for instance, Persia, came out of obscurity in the first year of the coming of the Bab. The faith is not in obscurity. Everyone knows what the faith is. They all know it's part of their language, it's part of their vocabulary. And then after that stage of obscurity, it will become emancipated and from the religious orthodoxy. And then it will become known as a world religion. It will emerge as a world religion. And then it will grow through these stages, which we don't want to go into all in details, but eventually it comes to a point where in a country, the majority of the people in a country become Baha'i. And that is the stage of sovereignty for the faith. And this lady who was the pilgrim asked, what is majority? And Shoghi Effendi said 51%. When majority of the people of a country become Baha'i, then then the Baha'i government comes into being in that country. And the laws of Baha'u'llah can function. The laws of the Kitab-i-Aqdas then can function. And Shoghi Effendi had said in this particular note that it is expected of the minority then to obey the government of the majority in the same way that we now obey the governments we live in under. But of course, the Baha'i government will honor the religious aspirations of the people and will give them every freedom to exercise their religious laws and teachings. And then if you go further in this particular branch of the Baha'i branch, you will find that more governments will become Baha'i governments, one after the other. I mentioned yesterday that really and truly you people should aim at making this country the first Baha'i government. And really we must not think at it in a unbelieving way, but rather believing that they will come, that we will have Baha'i governments. Now then you will have the second Baha'i government and the third Baha'i government and so on and so on. But then you see humanity is one. You can't divide it into two branches. Although we said for the sake of studying, we are having one branch, we call it non-Baha'i, and one branch we call it Baha'i, but humanity is one. And so more and more of these two processes will merge together as time goes on, merging together. People become Baha'i. Baha'i states come into being until such time that the majority of the nations in the world become Baha'i. It is then that these two processes that we have been analyzing in this way, these two processes completely merge together and meet together at the top. And he says as a result of this merging together, a child will be born. And that is the child of Baha'i civilization. And he says that is synonymous with the establishment of the most great peace. And it is synonymous with the birth of the world order of Baha'u'llah. And it is synonymous with the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth. And mankind will celebrate that day in the name of Baha'u'llah, the Father, who has brought this kingdom. And then that child of Baha'i civilization which is born will takes ages and centuries and thousands and thousands of years, 500,000 years, for the manifestations of God to come and enable that child of Baha'i civilization to grow into perfection, just like a child grows into an adult. And how the emphasis will be on nobility of man. That man will become noble. Now this is the vision of the future for us Baha'is. Now we are in the darkest period of the history of man, the darkest period, and it's closing in on us day by day, and coming to the point of completely sundering everything which belongs to the old days, the old order. We talked about it yesterday, how much we Baha'is should be confident, absolutely confident, that we are going to be here to bring the message of Baha'u'llah to masses of peoples after the destruction of the world and all that is therein. This is our function. This is why He has created us. We are created for this purpose. The peoples of the world do not know.
Mr. Taherzadeh, when does the universal persecution, the worldwide persecution that the Baha'i describes, where and when
Okay.
does it
All right. We cannot now. All right. We cannot now ever doubt the power of Baha'u'llah which is invested in his institutions, the power which he has got in it. Just as much as yesterday we were talking about the new life which comes out of the egg. The chicken coming out of the egg is the only thing which has got the power to stand on its own feet and to become the living organ of a new world. We must have faith in this. And we must prepare ourselves for the day that we are going to be there to bring great numbers into the faith. As Shoghi Effendi says, these institutions we are building becomes beacons of light to guide humanity at the time of its greatest peril. We are not worried about ourselves as to try to, we must never think of ourselves, oh, I want to protect myself. Well, you're all right, you will be protected. I can assure you will be protected. Well, if you want to take any actions, do. Nobody will stop you. But you know, a time will come that we will be guided when the guidance is needed. We will be guided as what to do. We will be guided by the House of Justice. And if they are not in contact with us because communications will be cut off, the time will come that we will not be able to communicate with them. Our institutions today, which are very weak, and we were talking about them yesterday, these very weak and insignificant institutions, which we think they are insignificant outwardly, these institutions will be so inspired, our national assemblies will be so inspired as to tell the friends what to do, where to go to protect themselves. It will come. This is already happening in some countries where there is a great deal of wars and dangers facing people. These institutions will be guided by Baha'u'llah because there is the spirit of life in them. The spirit of the cause is within them. It's pulsating within them. Although they may be weak. Yesterday, you remember we talked of the ministry of Baha'u'llah during the years that he lived in that mansion. Almost half of his ministry in Akka was spent in this building. It's really the climax of his revelation when God really ascended upon his throne. This is the throne in some of his writings referred to, is the throne of there is this building, the throne of God. And in the traditions it's very clear that when God sits on his throne, all the messengers and the concourse on high circumambulated. You can see in the writings too. Well, these two people wanted to circumambulate now this throne of their Lord. And when they went close to near the mansion, near the walls of the mansion, they found that 4 sides of the mansion is packed with people. Now they were not imagining things. They were not psychic people. They were very clear-headed. And they of course knew there's nobody from Akka. There's not one soul has left Akka at the time. There's nobody. There was none of these people. 4 sides. And they were filled with such awe. You can imagine the awe of that particular occasion must have been tremendous. That they couldn't go close. And they realized that to them this is really what their outer eyes could see. It was nothing but the souls of the manifestations of God and the concourse on high circumambulating the throne of their Lord. And so they went back, and then they circumambulated from long distance away in great awe and wonder, of having seen this. And he says that our shoes were filled with mud, and the whole area was wet, and all the mud that they went through. And then they quickly left for Akka. And they arrived just in time that they were closing the doors, the gates of the city. people of the East, that when something very, very important happens, they won't sleep that night. For instance, when you look at the passing of Baha'u'llah, when Baha'u'llah passed away, the friends don't sleep that night. They stay up in his memory and they say prayers. The same thing happens to the time of Abdul Baha passing. Now, Nabil said to my father, he said, tonight we must not sleep. We must stay awake. And Nabil was a man who used to drink a lot of tea. And he said to my father, he said, you make tea and I will write poems about this whole episode. And so that night, Nabil wrote the whole story of this in poetry. You know, many of Nabil's notes, Nabil, the historian of the faith, many of his notes are in poetry. You must not think that the first section of the Dawnbreakers, which Shoghi Effendi has edited for us, is exactly what Nabil has written it in this form. This is edited by Shoghi Effendi. Some of these notes are in different forms. He had put them together and produced it. And the rest of his memoirs and notes, which deal with the history of Baha'u'llah, which are not published yet, they are also, some of them, in this form. So that night he wrote this, the whole story of what had happened. And in the morning, the two of them sent to Baha'u'llah this poem of Nabil. And they also sent him, you know, in those days it was customary for the believers to send gifts to Baha'u'llah. Just like you give a box of chocolates now. In those days, the very popular thing was a sugar cone. You may not have seen what a sugar cone is like. In those days, sugar were made in the form of a cone, big cones, and then you break them for your tea and other uses. So they sent two of these as a gift to Baha'u'llah. And Baha'u'llah wrote a tablet. We don't have this tablet because maybe this was with Nabil's things. We haven't found it yet. And in this tablet, Baha'u'llah accepts their pilgrimage at a time that all the concourse on high were circumambulating the throne of their Lord. And he gives a new name to each one of them. Now, as I said, don't go along and tell the stories because it's bound to become it'll change in his career. I've heard people saying this because Shoghi Effendi used to tell this story to some of the pilgrims. And the pilgrims would come and say this story to an audience like this. And then I have heard myself that some other people have been saying this story. And when you say, how did he hear it? He heard it 2 or 3 steps away, which meant that it was so changed that it had just a bare resemblance to what I was telling you now. So here we are. You asked me to tell you the story. Now I feel that we better deal with some of these questions which are in here. Or what would you like me to do? Anybody has a question now? Yeah? The what? To do what? I don't know. Maybe they do. Yes? Yes? Well, that's, all these things, I suppose we are free to think in these terms if you want to do that. I don't know some of the answers, really. Well, Let me, yes?
Would you please speak to us a little bit about fear of God?
Oh, fear of God. Gosh, you're all going to be frightened, huh? No. I think it's a good point. Actually, somebody has asked this question. You know, Baha'u'llah has mentioned in many of his writings that the fear of God is what we have to, all of us, feel. And that he says, not until you have that fear of God in your hearts will you be able to progress. Now, you can read in the gleanings. I don't have it in here. In fact, if you had the gleanings here, we could find it for you and read it, those passages. But anyhow, we can read it later on, maybe. You can read it later on at some stage. He says this is the way in which man can progress spiritually. Now, we must remember here that fear of God, God is loving, God is just, God is full of bounties. Now, why can we fear him? How should we fear him? You know, first of all, let me mention this, because I said God has bounties and has justice. Do you know that it is through the bounty of God that we have come into being, not through his justice? It's a very important point to remember. It's not through the justice of God that man is created. And it is not also through the justice of God that divine revelations are sent. It's through the bounty of God. Now, Baha'u'llah has mentioned that if ever the justice of God comes into being, the whole creation will cease to exist. You see now? I'll explain to you. You know, if you have got some money in your pocket, and if you go to a shop, it is only just that the shopkeeper should give you something equal to your money. It's justice. You give him the money, he gives you the goods. This is justice. But what would you do if you went to a shop and you had no money at all, and the man gave you a lot of things? This is not justice. This is bounty. Now, Baha'u'llah says, look at yourself and see what you are. He says, you are a handful of dust. You're made from the dust. And the dust is the most worthless things you can find in this creation. It's the lowest kingdom. You're made of dust. And he says, look at, you had nothing. And he says, look what I gave you. I gave you the most precious entity in creation, and that is the soul. But you had nothing. So you see, creation comes into being purely through the bounty of God. If it was through its justice, we did not deserve anything, because we were dust. You see? This is a very significant point that he mentions. So the bounties of God is the cause of progress and development spiritually. If ever the justice comes into being, as he says, the creation will not exist, cannot exist. Disintegrates immediately, finishes. Now God, therefore, through his creation, he has brought about his bounties for us. And I mentioned yesterday how the forgiveness of God, that how much the forgiveness of God plays a role in life. Not in this life, but also in the next life. That is to say that through his forgiveness, all people will progress. Every person will progress in the spiritual worlds of God. We do not believe in eternal damnation. Every soul will grow. Even those who have had a terrible life here, who knows how God will deal with them? We don't know. We cannot here judge and say, oh no, this man is going to be treated this way or that way. Who knows? Baha'u'llah mentions one of his greatest enemies, who was the ambassador, Turkish ambassador, the Persian ambassador in Turkey, who was a great enemy of Baha'u'llah, who did so much to hurt him. Baha'u'llah says God may forgive him, because one of his relatives is a believer. You see? Who knows how God acts? So that there is no limit to God's love and mercy and forgiveness. But now let us examine fear of God. Fear comes to us when we are not able to cope with the situation. Now, isn't that right? Now, I'll give you an example of this. Say you are working in your office, or you're a student in a school. If you're a student, if you have not done your work in school, when the day of examination comes, you will be filled with fear. Not that the teacher frightens you, but that you are fearful because of your inadequacy, that you haven't done what you are supposed to do. If your boss, if your superior, or whoever you work for asks you to do something and you don't do it, you are filled with fear. This is how fear comes to us. It's because we are inadequate. We haven't done our job. Now let us put ourselves in position of coming face to face in the next life with God or whatever it is. I'm sure we won't see the essence of God, but shall we say with the manifestation of God, with Baha'u'llah, face to face with Him. Now I can have two conditions. Either I'm satisfied that everything He has asked me to do, I have done it absolute perfection, so I have no fear. Right? Now, that's the answer to it. Or, if I haven't done anything at all, I would be very fearful. There is another alternative if I'm not fearful. Maybe I'm not fearful because I don't think these things will happen in the next life. Maybe Baha'u'llah will never come face to face to me. Maybe He never asked me, why did you do this or that? But this is not true. We know that we will have to give account of everything. You see, Baha'u'llah mentions that. He says, keep your account every day before you are asked to give your account before God. So fear comes not because God is a fearful figure, that you are frightened of Him. But fear comes to us because we are inadequate. We look at our shortcomings. And then when you are going to really face Him, when you really realize, now this is the time, now I'm going to face Him, the fear of God is engendered in one's heart. This is really what it is, the fear of God. It's because we are conscious of our shortcomings. And then when you realize that what you had to do. Now I tell you, I had once an experience, and I'll share it with you. It's a personal experience, but I share it with you. You know how it is every time we have a problem in life, personal problem or any problem, we immediately go to God and pray to Him. As soon as you have a problem, you just take the prayer book and you sit down and you pray, the remover of difficulties and all the others that we are familiar with. Well, one day I was doing the same thing. And suddenly, now I can tell you there, really and truly, suddenly I saw Baha'u'llah, as if I saw Him in front of my eyes saying to me something. And you know what He said to me? Quite frankly, I got it very clear. He said, shame on you. This is what He said. Shame on you. Every time you have a problem, you come to me. Really? But did you ever come once to me and say, oh, please, help me to teach your faith, help me to serve your faith, I am longing to do something for you? No. You only come to me when you have a problem. Shame. Now, I really stopped praying. I just stopped it. Couldn't say anything. And it came to me like a thunderbolt. Now, you know, it's like this. And it became very clear that it was like this, that you have a very good friend. Say you have a very, very good friend, one of your best friends, a very influential friend, a very best friend that you have, that you give your life for him. And he lives, say, in another country. And he writes to you and he says, look, I want you to do something for me in here. I can't be in your country, but I want you to go to this shop and buy this and this and that for me. What would you do as soon as he writes to you? You immediately go and get it for him. He says, you are the only one who can do it. Go and get it for me. But what happens if I don't do it? I won't do it today, I won't do it tomorrow, I won't do it the next month, and the next month, and the next month, and the next year. I will never go to get this thing that my friend wants me to get for him. But then every time I need something, I'll go to him. And I expect him immediately to answer it. Now you see, this is exactly the situation. So that really when we think and we find that we have so much to do, and this life is so short. So much to do for Baha'u'llah. He has asked us to teach his faith. Now that's what I said, shame on me. That was the answer. I don't do it. And instead I go to him for all my problems. And then, when the real time comes, really, if Baha'u'llah would come and say to you, what have you done now in your life? Let us examine it. What have you got? What is the result of your whole life? What have you done? Well, this is where the fear comes. Because one is not adequate. But you know, there is one thing we must remember. Again, remember the forgiveness of God. Once you fear him, yes, then naturally one fear him. One fear that one hasn't done what he is supposed to do. But also remember the bounties, the love of your Lord. You know, our life is like this glass. You see, this glass of water here. Every service that we render is like a drop of water that you put in this. And at the end of a lifetime, all that you have is the result of your life. Here, you present it. This is what you have. That's what you take with us. That's what we take with us into the next life. We talked about it the first day. Remember, we said we can only take good things into the next life. And all our deeds is like this perfect water that we are taking with us. Drop by drop. We serve today, we serve tomorrow, and this adds together, accumulates together. But a little bit of impurities, then it will make the whole glass to become adulterated. A little bit of self, a little bit of ambition. These are the things will really destroy our services to the faith. There may be a man who has served an awful lot in this life. There have been some people like this. Served enormously, very on a great high scale. But at the end, they did something which destroyed it altogether. And so the cup of water, instead of being pure, it is adulterated. But there is one remedy which we can still have, and this is again a marvelous thing that we have this remedy. You know, have you seen in chemistry, there are some, if you have something, for instance, colorful, dirty, you just drop one little chemical into it, it'll purifies it, cleanse it immediately. And this is the same thing here in our deeds, in our life. We can cleanse our deeds and our actions with servitude, becoming a servant really, becoming selfless. That is like this chemical which will purify all the wrong things that one has done. And God will come to you then in great measures. This is why Baha'u'llah says, how many a person who has lived the life of service, and at the end, just at the end, when he is going to go, he does something which will ruin his whole life. All his services are gone. And how many a person who has lived a terrible life, and just at the time of his passing, through one deed, through the carrying out of one action, just like this chemical that I say, drop into this water, he will become completely absolved of all the wrong things he had done. And that's why he says,